vicious sheriffs, and gun barrels. California's false promises test fragile faith. The minister Casey begins to preach the gospel of a working folk sticking together, in Joad's words. His this world faith arouses the anger of a vigilante man who clubs the preacher dead. He laid preacher Casey on the ground, Guthrie sang. Outraged, Tom Joad then kills the deputy and sets out for a life on the run. Quoting Ford's film version almost verbatim, Guthrie's ballad ends with a homage to the idea, the hope really, of community and togetherness, the Great Depression tradition that both Steinbeck and Joad are working out. Tom tells his mother, quote, everybody might be part of one big soul. Well, it looks that way to me. So wherever you look in the day or the night, that's where I'm going to be, Mom. That's where I'm going to be. Wherever little kids are hungry and cry, wherever people ain't free, where men are fighting for their rights, that's where I'm going to be, Mom. That's where I'm going to be. In the novel, and again in the film, Tom Joad vows to spend the rest of his life bearing witness to inequality and struggle. Guthrie's Joad does the same, but with an important twist. Resignation and bitterness, these emotions hang over the book and the film. But Guthrie replaces them, not totally subsuming them, with the thrust of hope and a dash of determination. In his version, Tom Joad becomes a fearless union organizer. Mirroring Guthrie's own left-leaning community-based politics, his Tom Joad addresses the battle between the rich and the poor, and the need for working people to stick together through unions and political action, and they're named as such, to end the hardships put on them by the greedy. Like Ford's Joad, Guthrie's Joad will be there wherever little kids are hungry and wherever people ain't free. But he will also be there, in a clearly more political sense, again, wherever men are fighting for their rights. Guthrie, of course, did not simply cut scenes and imagery for Tom Joad from the film The Great Sarath. To be sure, the singer knew something about Joad and his imagined family. Born in Oklahoma in 1912, Woodrow Wilson Guthrie spent the first years of his life in relative comfort. We were a little bit different, Guthrie told Alan Lomax. His father was a real estate broker and, as we've heard, a local Democratic politician. But beginning in 1918, hard times hit the family. His father's business dried up and his political connections dissolved with them. Woody's mother, Nora, who had taught him how to sing, began a long and tortured battle with depression, exacerbated by the debilitating and, at this point, undiagnosed progression of Huntington's. Mysterious fires plagued the family as it slowly and painfully fell apart. Nora ended up in a rundown sanitarium, unable to recognize Woody. She died there in 1927. Beat and broken and robbed, in Joe Klein's words, of every illusion of hope, Charlie Guthrie left Oklahoma and settled in the Texas Panhandle, barely eking out a small farm living. Woody moved in with him in 1929, but he didn't stay long. In the middle of the 1930s, as the dust storms blew, Woody crisscrossed the country, going from Texas to California and back again. Along the way, he ran into the bum blockade set up by the police along the California-Arizona border and heard the well-to-do spit out the word Okie at him. During this time, Woody never held a steady job. He picked fruit, painted signs, and sailed with the merchant marines. Mostly, he got by on nickels and pennies and free meals by singing traditional songs for dislocated Okies in bars, on skid rows, and in migrant camps. In 1927, as we've heard again and again this afternoon and this morning, he settled in the LA suburb of Glendale and started a radio show with his cousin. Mixing folk ballads with homespun humor, their daily program gained and his subsequent programs gained a loyal following amongst local Dust Bowl refugees. Eventually, of course, the show took on a more political air and became more about the plight of the migrants and the injustices of the economic order. But the show worked, I think, in many ways because Guthrie portrayed himself as authentic. He portrayed himself, as Ed Cray says in his biography, as a true, quote, voice of the people, unlettered yet intelligent, end quote. By the late 1930s, Woody regularly appeared at CIO and Communist Party rallies. He explained to these audiences that his politics were really just an offshoot of his own common sense. Once he said, famously, he boasted, "I'm most proud of anything," he said, "is the fact that I seem to have been born in shade pink and didn't have to read many books to be a proletariat." As Woody's identification with the left strengthened, his fame grew, and that's what got him on the bill of that Steinbeck migrant farm worker fundraiser in New York in 1940. 4 months after the benefit, Victor released Woody Guthrie's Tom Joad. The song was part of Guthrie's famous collection, Dust Bowl Ballads, which he dedicated to Steinbeck, and on which he echoed many of the themes sounded in Steinbeck's novel and in Ford's film. Critics praised the collection, not so much for Guthrie's voice or music, but for its authenticity. Dust Bowl Ballads, the editors of a Brooklyn paper raved, quote, "tells a moving story as only singer Guthrie can tell it, with his true understanding of the plight of the Okies." Another critic wrote, "Here is a wry-witted word volcano, a prophet singer, who was there with the migratory workers in the California orchards and with the assembly line robots trying to become men in union organizing drives. Guthrie was there," this critic wrote, "on the trains and on the highways." Guthrie was, in other words, both a real victim and an honest witness, and that's why he mattered, as these publications proclaimed. The strongest proof that Guthrie was real, though, was his resemblance to Tom Joad, a fictional character. Observers repeatedly paired and even confused the songwriter with the Steinbeck character. Again, it didn't matter that Joad was a fiction. For many, he was real, the most real and recognizable emblem of the Great Depression. That, indeed, remains the incredible power of fiction, of Rocky even. The California radio producer's description of Guthrie could just as easily have been of Joad. Guthrie, he insisted, had ridden the jalopies, just like Joad. He had worked in the orchards and the fields, just like Joad. He had faced the cops and the clubs of vigilantes, just like Joad. A press release for Dust Bowl Ballads boasted that Guthrie's songs, quote, "document the great contemporary scene so dramatically related by John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath." The Daily Worker went even further, suggesting that Guthrie was a Joad himself. Quote, "he can tell you all about the Dust Bowl, the original characters of The Grapes of Wrath." What made Guthrie real then was not just growing up in Oklahoma or his experiences on the road, but his resemblance to Tom Joad. Over the years, Guthrie strengthened the connection between himself and Tom Joad, and here Guthrie is in the making of his own sort of self-myth. He named, for instance, his son, Jody Ben, or as Guthrie once said, the son of all poor folks on the road. Around the time of Jody Ben's birth, Guthrie wrote, quote, "The Grapes of Wrath, you know, it's about us, pulling out of Oklahoma and drifting around California, busted, disgusted, down and out, and looking for work." Like the song Tom Joad, the lesson was to organize. The Grapes of Wrath, Woody insisted, says, "You got to get together and raise hell till you get your job. Turn your farm back, and your house, and your chickens, and your groceries, and your clothes, and your money back." Working together, people could turn the world right side up, he declared. In later years, Woody Guthrie, sick with Huntington's himself and unable to perform, kept coming back to Tom Joad. 15 years after he typed out the Joad ballad, he wrote a play about the Okie everyman. Tom Joad still mattered to Guthrie. He was still needed to face the vigilante man and not back down. He still promised to stand by the hungry and crying children, organize the unorganized, and stand up for, in the words of Guthrie's play, to stand up for folks fighting for their rights. Guthrie was not the only one to come back to Tom Joad. Not the only one to come back to the Great Depression long after it ceased, and to the idea of the working poor and working people and class mattering in American life. As the California economy went into its post-war boom phase, California boosters created their own portraits of the Joad. In these pictures, they were now prosperous residents of new suburbs, testaments to American prosperity and renewal. They were also the Beverly Hillbillies. Like the Joads, the Hillbillies loaded their mattresses and bed frames on top of jalopy and headed to California. Yet these Joads of the American century came not to seek work, but to spend newfound wealth, the newfound wealth of a prosperous nation. But still, while the Clampetts hung out by their cement swimming pool, they didn't need to work. They remained, though, like the Joads, a family committed to each other and fighting off the schemes of the banker man. You remember Mr. Drysdale, right? Even as some tried to depoliticize the Joads, though, to tear them from the Great Depression, the family remained in the age of American prosperity, a link to hard times, and a call for equality and community. And they remained like Tom Joad, a voice of anger and disappointment. In the 1960s, social critic Studs Terkel molded his own Tom Joad, who in his telling was a sharecropper's son, into a new American everyman, an ordinary industrial worker who plays by the rules, battles against long odds, and gains only a precarious hold on the American dream of prosperity. Around the same time, a Chicago playwright turned the Joads into an African-American family battling slumlords and racism. In the 1950s, a college classmate handed Bob Dylan a copy of Guthrie's autobiography, Bound for Glory. Looking for a role model, young Dylan incorporated, of course, Guthrie into his life and music, mimicking his speech patterns and some of his songs. But perhaps most importantly, echoing in his early years, the political engagement and cultural enfranchisement of dispossessed that his mentor had taught him. In the 1990s, singer-songwriter Steve Earle worried that the nation was going straight to hell. He's probably right about that. There's killers on the highway, he sang, there's foxes in the hen house. Earle's solution? Come back, Woody Guthrie. Come back to us now, Earle sang. Tear your eyes from paradise, rise up again somehow, and if you run into Jesus, maybe he can help us out. Come back, Woody Guthrie, Steve Earle sang. And Bruce Springsteen would echo this line a few years later when he conjured up the ghost of Tom Joad and Woody Guthrie in his 1995 rumination on California and the sour state of the American dream. And again, on his most recent CD, Wrecking Ball, Springsteen delivers yet another angry tirade against the state of the nation. And again he returns to Guthrie and to the Joads. In the song Death to My Hometown, he sings, quote, get yourself a song to sing. Sing it hard, sing it well. Send the robber barons straight to hell. Hearing this refrain, one rock critic declared, it's Woody Guthrie for the foreclosure era. So again, we're back to Guthrie and back to Joad. And back to the idea of real witnesses to real suffering as the first step to renewing the nation's promises. Come back, Woody Guthrie. Thank you.